Hello and welcome to Outland Japan. I'm your host, Peter Carnell, a travel guide based in northern Nagano, and this is a podcast that takes you outside the big cities into rural, regional, and the wilds of Japan. And in today's episode, we head to the southwest of Japan's main island of Honshu and onto Tottori Prefecture. This sparsely populated corner of Japan is known for its rugged coast, including its famous sand dunes, a rare thing in Japan, Daisen Oki National Park, and the numerous peaks of Mount Daisen and Mount Mitoku. It is here, in beautiful, tranquil Tottori, that we find today's guest, Richard Pearce. Richard is the founder of Sustainable Daisen, an NPO dedicated to the protection of the Japanese Giant Salamander and the habitat it relies upon around Mount Daisen. Richard, along with his wife Kazumi, lead Sustainable Daisen in advocating for, researching and educating the public about the plight of the salamander, which, as Richard explains, is one of the largest amphibians in the world and is technically protected as a special natural monument of Japan, yet one that is under serious threat due to the impact of human action. Sustainable Daisen is endeavouring to address that while there is still time. I hope that my conversation with Richard sparks your interest in what he and Sustainable Daisen are doing, and that he and the salamanders act as ambassadors of sorts for Tottori and entice you to visit. Richard is outspoken about the causes he cares about, and as such, the threats faced by the salamander and the response or lack of response to those threats. This leads us into a wider conversation about the state of environmental and wildlife conservation in Japan, and how a foreign voice is received when critical of policies and practices here. It's really worth listening to, and in an effort not to edit too much out of our chat, I've split this episode into two parts. The first part that you're listening to now focuses largely on the salamander and the work of Sustainable Daisen, while the second part, available in a week from now, is a broader chat about environmental and wildlife advocacy in Japan. Links to everything we discuss, including Sustainable Daisen's website and social media, are in the show notes, along with links to the podcast website, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. All very easy to find. Just search Outland Japan. Now for my chat with Richard. I hope you enjoy. My guest on the podcast today is Richard Pearce, founder of Sustainable Daisen, an NGO involved in multiple projects, including education programs, rewilding, organic farming, and leading the charge to save the Japanese giant salamander. So lots to talk about. Richard, thanks for joining me. How are you doing today?
Good morning, Peter. Doing pretty good. Thank you very much. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to come onto your podcast and chat about all of these things.
Not at all. Not at all. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on. May I start by asking, where are you speaking to me from today?
I'm speaking to you from my house, which is on the side of Mount Daisen, which is a sacred mountain in Tottori Prefecture in the San-in region of Japan.
Okay. Now, Tottori is a prefecture many listeners might not have heard of before, even living in Japan. It's not a prefecture you often really hear about, at least here in Nagano. So would you mind placing it on the map for us? For example, where is it in relation to Tokyo, Kyoto, and the surrounding prefectures?
Sure thing. So Tottori is the least populated prefecture in all of Japan, as in it has the least number of people in it. There's Hokkaido, for example, is larger, so per kilometer there's more people in Tottori, but it has the lowest population. So it's basically west of Tokyo. By car, it would take about 10 hours, but by aeroplane, it takes about an hour. From Kyoto, sort of northwest, about 4 hours by car or by train. It follows the Sea of Japan coast. So the Sea of Japan coast is sort of to the north of the prefecture, and then to the south is the Chugoku mountain range.
Sparsely populated on the coast. What's it like as a place to live and to visit?
There's obviously good points and bad points, coming from the fact that it's quite rural. It's sort of famous for having ocean and mountains, as are other places in Japan, I guess, but sort of, it hugs the Sea of Japan like in its entirety. And then, the mountain range behind it. It's the Japanese countryside has many issues, sort of urban migration and the aging population, and Totori is probably a poster child of that. A particularly good point is the cost of land. I've got almost 4 hectares now, and I've spent a grand total of about $5,000 or something like that for almost 4 hectares of land, including a house and barn and whatnot. So it is somewhat isolated. A lot of if people come here as a teacher and they're not expecting it, and their dream is sort of Tokyo life, then it's very not that. But for me personally, it's a perfect fit.
May I ask, where are you originally from and how did you end up there?
I'm originally from a beautiful part of England in the UK called the Cotswolds. So I grew up in the countryside.
Yeah, definitely a beautiful area, yeah.
Yeah, it's really special. And I ended up in Japan in a sense by chance, but the more I live here, I realized it was more destiny, really. But before I came to Japan, I had literally zero interest and zero knowledge about Japan, other than it was this sort of bizarre culture far away that looked a bit like Star Trek, which is a good thing. That's a good thing. But I was very much more of, I'm a wildlife loving person. So in my mind, Japan wasn't exotic enough in terms of wildlife. So I was more drawn to Africa and the jungles of Southeast Asia with the cobras and whatnot, tigers. But I did a round the world trip when I was 24, and it was amazing. And I didn't go to Japan. And then after returning to my parents' house in a little village in the Cotswolds, suddenly my world shrunk. I was like, oh my goodness, I need to get out of here, but I don't have any money. And I was like, somebody told me in New Zealand about a teaching program called the JET program in Japan. I should have a look at that. And literally went online, applied, bloody, interviews and whatnot. And several months later, I was in Totori. So I say that is important for my journey because it was very, blank slate. You know what I mean? Literally, I had no preconceptions. I was not interested, and I'm still not, in manga and popular nerdy Japanese culture. Each to their own. But yeah, that's how I just ended up here.
Yeah, it resonates with me because actually, I think I've spoken about it on the podcast before. One of the reasons that when I was young, growing up through the 80s and then a teenager in the 90s, this is pre-internet, or as I was finishing school, internet was just coming on, certainly not the internet we have today. And at that time, Australia had 4 TV stations, no cable, no internet, no low-cost airline. So getting out of Australia was very expensive. So the rest of the world, for me as a kid and as a young teenager, really felt like a long, long way away. And so I was really always obsessed with other cultures, particularly the older cultures, the better. India, China, but Japan was never on my radar at all either.
Right.
And so I traveled a lot. And Japan for me I came here quite late and without really giving it much thought, actually. And like you, not particularly knowing much about Japan or a fan of Japanese culture, which in some ways I think is a good way to approach it.
Yeah, I think without bias, and then sort of just experience it and make your own judgment, and then if you're interested in it, and then learn about it. So when I was given my post of Sakai Minato in Totori, my JET placement, so I went online and I googled Sakai Minato. So this is like 2005, I think, and basically nothing. There was almost nothing to be found about Sakai Minato. And at the time, I thought, brilliant. I'm so happy there's no information about it, because that makes it more exciting and adventurous.
As mentioned, you're the founder of Sustainable Daisen. Richard, would you mind explaining how Sustainable Daisen came into being, the motivations behind it, and the projects you're involved in?
Well, that's a pretty big question, to be honest with you.
Good.
So, sit back and strap in. It comes down to the fact that I've always been passionate and interested in nature and nature conservation since I was probably 4 years old. Had a tree, a buddleia tree out the front of my parents' house, which attracted butterflies. And that was, I was all about identifying them and knowing every type of species, whilst other friends were going around with nets trying to catch them. You know what I mean? I was that was really clear from even then. I know I spent time in Africa after university, and I studied environmental management. I trained as a safari guide. I've done projects in Madagascar and Tanzania and a few other places as well. So I always had that thought in my mind and that sort of drive to protect nature wherever I end up. So I did the standard teaching thing, and it's not the most rewarding job. So I was lucky enough to get a position as a tour leader in Japan. I would take groups of up to 16 people all over Japan. Because I was based in the Sanin, so Tottori Shimane region, I was convinced that, I'm a foreign guy. I love this place. Guy, doesn't matter. I'm a foreigner. So surely if foreign guests come to this area and I'm able to introduce them to the things that I've discovered and I like, they would really like it too. I designed some tours for a great company called Inside Japan. Basically, I became a bit of an expert on inbound travel for this region. So because of that reputation, the management of Daisen Oki National Park contacted me to ask for advice about how to attract more foreigners to this region. So I'm just pouring tea. That's probably going to make some noise. We talked about, different aspects, the good points mostly about this area and especially about nature. And the national park people work for the Ministry of Environment, so they have an interest in nature. And they mentioned that they've been trying to get a Japanese giant salamander conservation experience off the ground in a place called Nichinan, which is the other side of Mount Daisen. And they were working with a leading researcher trying to get it off the ground. So they invited me to go and check it out and give my thoughts and advice about if it was a viable project. I met the researcher, Dr. Okada, renowned expert, and had the opportunity to get in the river with waders on and meet a Japanese giant salamander. So in the daytime and the nighttime. And I was blown away by this experience, really, because such a large, amazing, ancient creature, really up close, literally the first one I saw did a U-turn and walked up between my legs and rubbed past my boot as it did so. So I had that real connection from the very first salamander, which I kind of feel was almost like fate as well. That really locked me in. Having experienced that, I realized two things. Well, three things, I guess. First was, wow, this is amazing. And I'm sure if it's organized properly, it's going to be popular and people are going to have an amazing almost life-changing experience for some people. Secondly, the salamanders are in a lot of trouble and they could even die out. This is a creature that's been in its present form for 23 million years, could be gone within the next couple of decades. And then third, I realized unless I was directly involved, this was never going to get off the ground. So because of that, I then started running Japanese giant salamander tours. It became really popular, people coming from all over the world, and it was all great. Around the time, having talked with the expert, I learned about the situation of the giant salamanders in Daisen town, which was actually where I lived, and also actually in the river basin, which just happened to be a few hundred meters down the street from where, at the time, I ran a guest house. So again, okay, that's pretty cool. So, and it turns out that habitat, which is what I'm involved in protecting now, the Nawa River habitat, is unique. It's the lowest altitude breeding ground, really small area, but got quite a high density, relatively high density of salamanders living there. But because it's kind of lower altitude, it also means there's more human nature conflict going on. even more
naturally,
concrete than normal, all that kind of thing. So basically, I discovered like no one was doing anything practical to conserve the salamanders in this river basin. There were a couple of groups, I don't want to say pretended, that sounds a bit harsh, who presented the image that they're doing something. And this is a common thing in Japan. But when you actually ask them, what have you actually done practically? What pressure are you putting on the government, for example? Because the government are the ones causing most of the problems, which we'll talk about in a bit. What are you doing? And they're doing nothing. So I was like, okay, then literally I'm going to have to do this, because if I don't, they're going to die in this river system. And it's like that. I hope that doesn't sound arrogant. I really wish it wasn't the truth, because it's taken so much of my time, which I don't mind, and it's been rewarding, but it's also been equally or more frustrating and depressing as well. Then the best way to be official and get sort of Japanese backing is to have a non-profit organization, like a properly established entity, and then which is ridiculously complicated in terms of paperwork. But
no surprise there.
My wife, yeah, right. And my wife stepped up and nearly cost me my marriage in a way, because it was so stressful. But she did a really great job, and then Sustainable Dyson was born.
I followed you for quite some time, but it was a story that you posted about a month or so ago, accounting for how you stumbled upon the apparent destruction of an important habitat that you had already identified, documented, and were monitoring. And then you accounted for the aftermath of that discovery, which prompted me to get in touch, to request to have an interview with you. Perhaps we can come back to that story and to find out what happened and what's the latest. To begin, can you give me a little bit more detail about the salamander itself? I mean, for anyone who is not familiar with it, what does it look like? What are the important things we need to know about this creature?
The Japanese giant salamander is an amphibian. An amphibian means both, so it can live in and out of the water. That's a real basic fact for you right there. In the world, presently, there's 3 types of giant salamander. In North America, you have a species called the hellbender. Very dramatic, very American name.
I approve of this name.
So you approve of it, yeah. I mean, they also call it the snot otter, which is less.
So now it's interesting, because this is the thing. Because one thing I like about America, they come up with much better names for things and places than Australians do. Australians would probably call it the snot otter. That's what we would come up with.
Yeah, I think you would.
The hellbender sounds a bit more marketable.
Yeah, hellbender. Yeah, it's cool. It sounds quite Japanese in a way, like anime kind of.
Yeah, right.
The wind. I'm not an anime person, but anyway. So you got that one. That one grows up to around about 70 centimeters, 2 and a bit feet. That's a singular species. So in China, you have up to about potentially 5 different species of Chinese giant salamander. They have all sorts of issues. They're farmed heavily for food. So because of that, there's been a lot of genetic mixing. They're technically the largest, and they can grow up to 180 centimeters, which is 6 feet. So in Japan, you've got the Japanese giant salamander, which again is a singular species, and that can grow up to 150 centimeters. Yeah, which is 5 feet. I've seen in the wild measured just under a meter, and I've seen, which I hope to find again and measure before too long, someone that looked around 120 centimeters. They potentially could live up to 100 years in the wild. It's thought.
It's unknown, right?
Yeah, well, it's unknown because 100 years ago, no one marked one and has followed its journey ever since. But it's to do with the fact that actually in the 1800s, one was taken from Japan to the Netherlands, and it was already fully grown, which therefore made it probably around 50 years old. And then it lived for 56 years in Holland. So that's the most complete record of a lifespan of an individual one. What do they look like? They look like the bottom of the river. So it takes a keen eye or a trained eye to spot them. generally speaking, in a healthy environment anyway. So that is my superpower now. I'm quite proud of it. I can spot them pretty quick.
May I jump in and ask, is there variation in their colouring, or are they all very similar?
They have a light brown base, like their skin is a light brown, and then they have darker brown patches on. So depending on the number of patches or spots, if you like, they can go anywhere from they look almost yellow to almost black.
Oh, really?
Honestly, within a 50 to 100 meter range within a river, it can be almost completely, it looks like a different species.
What's the coloration related to? Is that to do with age? Is it to do with the biological sex?
There's no research or evidence about specifically why that is. Basically, like I said, they look like the bottom of the river. They look like, the rocks and riverbed. Different riverbeds look a little bit different, and that's how it is. I mean, I'm pretty sure there must be some level of genetic influence on their coloration. But like I said, even within a very small section of river, relatively speaking, like a kilometer or even less, there's really crazy level of color variation.
And is there a discernible difference in terms of size between male and female?
In terms of how they look, generally they have a wider head, the male, with defined jaw muscles. And that's for biting. And that's only for biting other giant salamanders. So what's interesting? So I say that because they use suction feeding. So visually, with a sort of trained eye, you can kind of see the difference in the head shapes. With the larger males, you're like, yeah, that's a boy. And often it will have missing digits on its feet and scars from fighting with other males. The most interesting point probably is its paternal instincts and care for the young. So breeding season is late August to mid-September, somewhere around there. And what happens is the weeks and months leading up to that, the large males will return to a preferred breeding nest, which they don't use for shelter outside of the breeding season. And they will fiercely defend that nest. And by fiercely, so other males will try to take over that nest. And the fights are then brutal. So deep scars, limbs missing, or even death for these. And you're talking potentially 2 1 meter long creatures going at it. It's brutal. I've not seen them fight, but I've seen the scars and the missing and the damage done after. So then what happens? So you've got this established what's called a nushi or a den master. So it's controlling this nest. And then a single female or even multiple females will enter the nest. Probably they release a pheromone, which makes the males calmer. They deposit the eggs and then they leave. And that's all the females have to do. It's a pretty nice life as a female.
So they don't actually mate. They just
so it's external fertilization. So they leave the eggs in the nest, and then the male will give them his magic juice. Basically, the toughest, most warrior-like male will be controlling that nest because he's the one that's winning the fighting. And then he will stay in and around the nest for up to 7 months, defending the eggs, fanning the eggs with its tail to make sure there's enough oxygen. It will also eat the dead eggs so the bacteria doesn't spread. And then until they've left the nest, and said 6-7 months later, that's his job. The toughest hardcore male, and only them, basically spend more than half of the year looking after their young and being a dad.
Now, it's my understanding that the salamander is designated as a special natural monument and treasure of Japan. Curious what those designations entail and what protections do they grant to the giant salamander?
Yeah, they're designated as a special natural monument of Japan, which means they have special protection and come under the care of the culture department. And basically what that rule means is only licensed handlers can legally touch them. And this was in 1950. this designation was made. And at that time, I guess because of after World War II, protein and was scarce, so easy protein source. And there was a culture of eating the giant salamanders pre-1952. And they were being harvested at a rate that was unsustainable. So they introduced that rule. Something is better than nothing. But actually, in my experience and in my opinion, that rule has actually made things worse. And that's because the general public, those who know about salamanders, generally know they are protected like this. So they presume the situation is under control and it's fine. But the simple fact is, it doesn't do any good to only protect the animal if you don't protect the habitat. So if you take a section of the river, don't touch the salamander, can I tip concrete all around it so it can't move and breed? Yeah, sure, go ahead. Doesn't make any sense. Having to educate people that the salamanders aren't okay is a really big, important step, because there is this belief, they're protected as a special natural monument equals they're fine. They're really not. So actually, I have a handling license. There's such a lack of research and researchers because of this rule. And then with the current problems with hybridization with Chinese giant salamanders, which we can get on to, because it's a huge threat. There's just not enough people to really get out there and know what's going on.
I imagine one of the great challenges in terms of your role in trying to raise awareness for the conservation of this animal is educating the public as to why an animal they're likely never to encounter is worth saving.
Yes.
So how do you go about doing that?
Let me put it this way. We've had great success in getting foreign support, non-Japanese support, and awareness, spreading awareness in the international community. But in Japan, it's much more difficult. It's been a much bigger challenge. The important thing to know is this creature has basically remained unchanged for 23 million years. That's crazy. So it's considered a living fossil or a living dinosaur, I've heard people say. And if you compare that, Homo sapiens, our species, has been around anywhere from 400,000 years to 1 million years, depending on which research you read. But let's say 400,000 or 500,000 years. So compare that to 23 million years as a species. And the fact that this species could die out within the next couple of decades, that should be huge. Yes, the animal is found within Japan, but it's you don't own it. The Japanese don't own it, but it's your responsibility to do something about it.
What are the most pressing threats facing the salamander?
We can really break that down into three kind of categories of threat. So if I focus on this river basin, the one that I'm most involved in protecting, which is the Nawa River Basin on the northern face of Mount Dyson. Well, kind of obvious one, I guess, which is true for any riverine creatures in the world pretty much, is pollution and general habitat degradation. And there's a huge issue here of unsustainable and, let me just be honest about it, terrible farming practices, which results in a lot of animal waste ending up directly in the river system, which, because of the extra nitrogen and phosphorus, but then you're talking also heavy metals from feed and medicine, is very damaging for the giant salamanders and for anything in the river, right? That's a kind of a general one for many species. But the biggest one, arguably, here is what's called habitat fragmentation. If you've spent any time in Japan, and this is something I'm sure we're going to talk more on, we can talk for hours, Japanese love concrete. And rivers have been canalized, so which means straightened, with concrete sides. And because they've been straightened, and normally they're straight, why would they straighten them? What's the point of that? Well, often it's so they could make the rice fields at the side of the river more uniform in shape, so that it's easier to work out how many pesticides and chemicals they need.
Basically, and I've always assumed to push the flooding down to the next town. It's
exactly,
problem, not
right?
ours.
And this is a huge issue in the UK at the moment with the floods, and they're talking about making the rivers windy again, because what nature knew best? Who knew? When you strain a river, especially sort of in rice field areas, you then need to slow it down and also divert the water. So what that means is they install called weirs, or agricultural dams, which are basically sort of concrete walls within the river. They divert the river off to the rice fields, and they also create drag, where there's sort of like a waterfall effect, which has the effect of slowing it down. And what these concrete walls in the river mean is that creatures are unable to move up the river. So if we take the case of salamanders, but also obviously for fish and eels and everything else, they're unable to move up to breed. So that's obviously a huge problem. If you don't have breeding, then you don't have an animal. But another problem with that is the fact that, during heavy rains, of which, of course, there are more and more torrential rains these days, salamanders are washed down the river, and they don't have many sheltering places because the side of the rivers are concreted up, so they can't get into holes in the bank, and they get washed closer and closer to the ocean, and they're unable to move up. And then basically once they get into the ocean, they're dead. Or even if they're in brackish water near the ocean, they will die of kidney-related diseases because of the prey they're having to consume, which is salty. If we take the Nawa river system, it's quite short. It's only about 6 kilometers from ocean to source. But I've managed to count on the map. There's 53 concrete walls, 53 weirs.
So many foreigners who live here comment on it, and I find the really concerning thing that when you raise it with Japanese, it's just not on their radar. Like, why is this river concreted?
Yeah.
As I mentioned to you, I was driving yesterday through the back roads from my place to Hakuba. No one's up there. You're not protecting any rice fields or feeding any rice fields or protecting any villages. Stopped off at a very beautiful little spot, beautiful river, what I thought was meandering through the mountains, untouched. And no, you sit there for a moment and then you spot the little, only a 5-meter little concrete barrier around the bend of a river. I'm like, what is that protecting? Anyway, so it's
No, it just makes it worse. And like I said, and now in Europe, they're beginning to remove the weirs and the barriers and make it winding again, because that's how rivers are supposed to be.
Who knew?
Who knew? So that's a huge thing. And then I need to talk about the third and biggest threat to the Japanese giant salamanders. So in the 1950s, they were protected as supposedly as a special natural monument to stop the harvesting of them for food. And pretty much seemingly that kind of stopped the industry of farming and eating Japanese giant salamanders. I'm sure some of it went on for a while, but it was at a rate that wasn't a threat. But seemingly one businessman, so-called, from Okayama Prefecture, imported 800 Chinese giant salamanders as a kind of food operation to make a farming business. Cut long story short, most of those salamanders ended up in rivers and lakes and even in the moat of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. So they were just scattered about. And then what's happened since then is the Chinese and the Japanese giant salamanders can interbreed, and their offspring, which we can call hybrids, are far more aggressive and stronger, but aggression being the key point, than either of the parent species. And especially, so what the importance of aggression in this regard, so if we remember we talked about that the top males fight for a breeding nest, and basically the DNA of the strongest one is then what's in the river. So these hybrids, which are more aggressive, so they get more food, they grow faster and they're stronger, have taken over the breeding nests. So all the future young offspring of the salamanders in the river are becoming hybrid. I said, what does it matter? It's still a giant salamander, blah, blah, blah. but it's a new species. And basically, in river systems where the Chinese have been introduced, or the hybrids have also gotten in there, they've completely pushed out the native species, which means the 23 million year old Japanese giant salamander is disappearing, and you're left with this hybrid, this new species. Yeah, it's a disaster.
Which brings us to the incident which occurred recently and that you documented online. Could you run through what took place?
This is kind of outside of the three main threats that I talked about, but this was about just bad environmental stewardship, and again, it's connected to local government. There's a really beautiful, surprisingly healthy, short section of a feeder river here, which was unstudied until I studied it, which is, again, like, why does it take an English guy to be the one that climbs down the banks and gets into this fairly inaccessible river system? There's an amazingly beautiful, important, and healthy section of a feeder river near here. It's paradise, and this is where I often take guests these days. And it's completely unresearched. Much to my amazement, it's like, how did no one know about this before I found it? I organized for a group of international experts to come, and together we've done some research on it. So it's really, we know it's really important, but we're still yet to convince government that it's important. Around this river stream, basically, is a monoculture forest plantation, which is a huge problem for Japan. It's, and again, another subject. A few months ago, I went down into the river, actually with a quite famous YouTuber, TV guy from the States called Forrest Gallant. And then when we got down there, I was just shocked beyond belief at the condition of the river where they'd been doing some forestry work. And basically what happened is they'd been clearing some trees, and the foresters had just thrown all the discarded branches and trees into the river, into the stream itself, blocking it up and just making it unlivable for any creature. Yeah, I was just could not believe it that anyone would be that careless. You know, I know some connected people that are in this area, so I spoke to one old guy I know, and straight away and said, you know, this is terrible what's happened. So then he called the top of the forestry group, and then hearing my name and knowing that it's not so easy to get me to shut up and go away, they suddenly went into panic and reaction mode. And they called the forest. They said, oh, okay, we're going to get the foresters to come and clear it out. And I'm like, I'm going to be there because I need to tell them what they can and can't do. And they went, okay. So I met the foresters a couple of days later, and they were nice enough people, to be fair. But anyway, and I explained to them how important the condition is and how terrible and devastating what they've done is. And basically then I instructed them, you need to pull this out, but you cannot use heavy machinery to do it. You can't drive a digger to the edge and use the grab to pull it out. You need to get in there and pull it out. To their credit, they actually did get into the river, about 5 or 6 staff members, and spent a week with small chainsaws and pulled it out, which cost them a lot of money and time, right? But then they actually called me and asked, can you please come and inspect it? Because they knew if there wasn't good enough, I'm not going to let it go. So I went down there and we walked up the river, and even then we found some salamanders. So I said, look, this is a really important place. Like, this is so terrible what you've done. This can't happen again. To their credit, they'd gotten a lot of it out, but not enough in my view. So then what followed was, for a couple of years, a group of US Marines from the Iwakuni base had come up and helped me with various conservation projects, including building of ramps using stones up the weirs in the feeder rivers and clearing out a tunnel that was blocking the movement of the salamanders. So they've been really great. So I knew they were coming up. So I basically made the decision, right, we're going to go to that river where still there's a lot of debris. And we spent a whole day, 20 US Marines or so, and a group of local people, not so many, a couple. And we spent the whole day pulling branches out of the river. And as soon as we did that, suddenly young salamanders started to appear. But importantly, one of the most devastating things about this whole thing was that during the research the year before, we'd recognized what looked like a breeding nest. There was a really old, gnarly male outside of what looked like a clear tunnel into the bank, which is actually really rare to find it that obvious. So we'd actually placed a camera trap to kind of record it. And that nesting site, potential nesting site, was right in the middle of the very worst of the destruction that these foresters are called. So anyway, after we cleared it all out and, the Marines had been, and, we got it looking much, almost to how it was before. There was obviously still some damage. I did some tours and research in that stretch of river, and that male was outside of that nest again. So basically, we'd saved that nest, potentially an important breeding nest. Again, I don't want to sound like, oh, I'm the hero or whatever. It's just, why is this necessary? Why does it take an English guy to kick off for something to happen? And then for me to have to organize a group of other foreigners to come up and pull the rest of the branches out on a so-called special natural monument, right?
Which underscores the fact that support is really vital to success of what you're doing there. So for anyone who is interested to get involved, to visit and see what you're doing, or just to get in contact with you, how can they do so?
Well, there's two ways. So the Sustainable Dyson, the non-profit organization, has a website, sustainabledyson.org. We have an Instagram page, which is Japanese Giant Salamanders. That's the handle. And then my own, so I'm still a nature guide, and I'm really passionate about the importance of genuine ecotourism as a conservation tool. So I do operate nature and viewing and conservation tours. So my own company is called Bushido Japan. So it's bushidojapan.com. You can book a viewing or conservation tour. I said the difference between a viewing and conservation tour is in the viewing tours, we literally go into the rivers, we walk up and we look for the animals, and then probably half the time they'll stay still long enough that we can literally kneel down next to them and without causing them any stress. Other times, we find them and then they'll start to move away slowly. But either way, you can get, really have a great interaction with them. We're not allowed to touch them, of course. Well, technically I am, but during those tours I don't. And then the conservation tours, which is more what I want to move towards now that I'm licensed, is where we go into the same river or different stretches of river. We look for the salamanders, find one, carefully put it into a net, put it into a measuring tube, collect the biometric data. How long are they? How heavy are they? General checking their health and recording the scars, the condition of the eyes and things like that. And then also putting in a pit tag into them if it's an individual we're finding for the first time. Yeah, minimal stress. It doesn't cause them any issues moving forward. And then when we find them, we can just use a scanner and it goes beep, it tells you the number. And then over the years, we can go, okay, this one has moved down here, or this one has grown this much. So we can really begin to understand the particular population. Because without that data, it's much harder to get any kind of official protection.
As always, I'll include links in the show notes of today's episode to the website, your Instagram. Make sure to get on there. It's a very nicely presented Instagram, and I'll put images on the Instagram account for the podcast, Outland Japan. So whether you're in Japan or planning to come or you're abroad, there's lots of ways to get involved, whether it's visiting, making donations and things like this. So make sure to check it out. And if you are interested, don't hesitate to get in touch. That's it for the first half of my chat with Richard. Sustainable Daisen's website is sustainabledaisen.org. Daisen is spelt Daisen, and you can find them on Instagram and Facebook by searching Sustainable Daisen. You can also find information on Richard's bushidojapan.com website. That's BUSHIDO Japan.com, including salamander conservation and viewing experiences, and Richard's wildlife and conservation tour of Japan and his guided experiences at Mount Daisen. The pod website is, of course, outlandjapan.com, and you'll find us on Facebook, Insta, and YouTube by searching Outland Japan. Normally, I'd sign off by saying I'll be back in a couple of weeks' time, but in this case, I'll be back in a week from now with the second half of my chat with Richard. Until then, bye for now.